https://www.youtube.com/watch?v=sign KV7SURIT8 transcript. It was just a battered piece of photographic paper, faded at the edges and creased down the middle. To the street thugs who stole it, it was garbage. To 72-year-old Arthur Higgins, it was his breathing heart, the very last picture of his late wife. Within hours, the Hells Angels made those thieves wish they had never been born. The rain was coming down in thick gray sheets over Oakland, California, hammering against the corrugated tin roof of Arthur Higgins' detached garage. It was a Tuesday night in late November, the kind of night that soaked right through to the bone. At 72, Arthur's bones already ached enough. He sat in his worn recliner, nursing a mug of black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, staring blankly at the muted television. Arthur was a man carved from a different era. His forearms, though thinning with age, were still wrapped in the faded blue-green ink of tattoos he'd gotten in the late 1970s. For 30 years, he had been a heavy diesel mechanic, wrenching on big rigs until his arthritis forced him to hand over his tools. But his real passion, his lifeblood, sat out in that cold garage, a pristine custom-built 1948 Harley-Davidson Panhead. He had rebuilt every inch of that motorcycle with his own two hands. Yet the bike's true value had nothing to do with chrome or horsepower. Tucked deep inside the heavy leather of the left saddlebag, wrapped meticulously in a piece of oiled canvas and slid into a waterproof Ziploc, was a Polaroid photograph. It was taken in the summer of 1998 at the lip of the Grand Canyon. In the photo, his wife Martha was leaning back against the bar of the Panhead. Her wild blonde hair whipped across her smiling face, laughing at something Arthur had just said off camera. 3 years ago, pancreatic cancer had taken Martha in a matter of brutal, agonizing months. In the chaos of hospital bills, moving to a smaller house, and the blinding fog of grief, a basement flood had destroyed the boxes containing their family photo albums. That single heavily protected Polaroid in the saddlebag was the only surviving photograph Arthur had of the woman he had loved for 4 decades. At 1:14 a.m., a sharp, unnatural crack echoed through the drumming rain. Arthur bolted upright. The sound hadn't come from the street. It came from the backyard, from the garage. Ignoring the sharp pain. In his knees, Arthur grabbed the heavy steel Magite flashlight he kept by the door and stepped out into the freezing downpour. He didn't bother with a coat. He crossed the muddy grass, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. As he rounded the corner of the house, the beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness and illuminated a nightmare. The heavy wooden double doors of his garage were splintered. The solid steel padlock lay in the mud, sheared clean in half by industrial bolt cutters. "No," Arthur rasped, his voice barely audible over the rain. "No, no, no," he rushed inside, flicking the light switch. The bare bulb buzzed to life, casting harsh shadows across the empty concrete floor. The drip pans were there, his toolbox was there, but the center of the room was empty. The Panhead was gone. Arthur dropped the flashlight. It clattered against the concrete, the beam spinning wildly before settling on a puddle of muddy water mixed with fresh oil drops leading out to the alley. He fell to his knees, his hands trembling violently. He didn't care about the thousands of dollars worth of vintage motorcycle parts. He didn't care about the engine he had meticulously tuned. "Huh? Martha?" He choked out, the tears finally mixing with the rain dripping from his face. "That took her." It took 20 minutes for the Oakland Police Department to arrive. 2 young patrolmen, Officer Miller and Officer Jenkins, stepped out of their cruiser, their uniforms shielded by bright yellow raincoats. They walked the perimeter, shining their flashlights into the alleyway, looking thoroughly unimpressed by the tragedy that had just destroyed Arthur's world. "Looks like a professional snatch and grab, Mr. Higgins," Officer Miller said, clicking his pen and scribbling on a soaked notepad. "Vintage Harleys are highly targeted. They likely backed a box truck right up to the alley, rolled it in, and were gone in 60 seconds. You have to find it," Arthur pleaded, gripping the officer's sleeve. "I don't care about the insurance money. There's a picture in the saddlebag. It's the last picture of my wife. She passed away. It's all I have left." But Officer Jenkins offered a sympathetic but entirely hollow sigh. "We'll put out a BLOB on the lookout for the bike, sir. But I have to be honest with you, these rings work fast. By tomorrow morning, That bike will either be in a shipping container bound for overseas or it'll be stripped down to the frame and sold for parts. Any personal items in the bags are usually tossed in a dumpster. Arthur stared at them, a cold, dark realization settling over him. The police were treating this like a statistic. To them, it was just another property theft in a city plagued by property theft. They would file the paperwork, hand it off to a detective who already had 100 open cases, and the Panhead and Martha's smile would vanish into the criminal underworld forever. He watched the cruiser pull away, its red and blue lights fading into the foggy night. Arthur walked back into his house, dripping wet, shivering, and entirely alone. He walked into his bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of his dresser. He pushed aside a stack of old flannels and pulled out a small dusty wooden cigar box. Inside was a small leather-bound address book, its pages yellowed and brittle. Arthur hadn't opened this book in over 10 years. He had walked away from the rougher edges of his youth when he married Martha. But Arthur Higgins was not just a retired mechanic. Back in the day, he had run with men who lived outside the boundaries of polite society. He had fixed their bikes, patched up their engines, and on one particular night in Sturgis in 1989, he had taken a heavy beating to protect one of their rising leaders from a rival gang. He flipped through the pages until he found a number scrolled in thick black ink under the name Bronson. Arthur picked up his rotary phone, his arthritic finger dialing the numbers with desperate precision. The law had told him there was no hope. It was time to call the outlaws. The phone rang 4 times before a growly deep voice answered. Background noise, heavy bass from a jukebox, the clinking of beer bottles, and rough laughter bled through the receiver. "Yeah, Clubhouse," the voice grunted. "I need to speak to Big Jim Bronson," Arthur said, his voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Who's asking at 2 o'clock in the morning?" "Tell him it's Arthur Higgins." "Tell him, the mechanic from Sturgis 89 needs his marker," called him. There was a long pause. The background noise seemed to muffle slightly, as if a hand had been placed over the receiver. 2 minutes passed. Arthur held his breath. Then a new voice came on the line. It was heavier, older, carrying the undeniable weight of authority. "Arthur, Iron Arthur." "Son of A, I thought you were dead," Jim Bronson said, a hint of genuine warmth cutting through his intimidating temper. Jim was now the president of the local Hells Angels charter, a man whose reputation commanded absolute respect on the streets of the Bay Area. "I'm still breathing, Jim," Arthur replied, his voice finally cracking. "But I need help, and the cops can't do it." Arthur quickly explained what had happened. He didn't focus on the bike. He told Jim about Martha. He told him about the cancer, the flooded basement, and the Polaroid wrapped in canvas inside the saddlebag. Silence hung on the line for a long, heavy moment. "They took a man's ghost," Jim said quietly, his tone shifting from friendly to dangerously cold. "You sit tight, Arthur. Put a pot of coffee on." Less than 30 minutes later, the deep, guttural roar of heavy twin engines shattered the quiet of Arthur Street. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the fog was still thick. 4 motorcycles pulled up onto Arthur's driveway, their headlights cutting through the mist. Arthur opened the front door. Big Jim Bronson walked up the steps, stepping into the porch light. He was a towering figure, broad-shouldered, wearing a heavily weathered leather cut, displaying the iconic Wind Death's head on the back. Accompanying him were 3 men. Was a heavily tattooed sergeant at arms with cold assessing eyes. Declan, a younger, fiercely loyal enforcer, and a prospect named Leo, who immediately stayed back to guard the bikes. Jim pulled Arthur into a rough embrace. "Good to see you, old man." "Sorry, it's under these circumstances." They walked out the garage. Wyatt pulled a massive magite from his belt and examined the splintered wood and the sheared padlock. He crouched down, running a gloved finger over the mud in the alley. "Julie truck," Wyatt muttered, examining the tire treads. "Heavy load." They backed it in fast, cut the lock, rolled the iron, and peeled out. "Professional crew." "The cops said it'll be in pieces by morning," Arthur said, looking at Jim. "The cops don't know the streets," Jim growled.
Nobody trips mint 48 Panhead.
"It's too recognizable, and the parts are too niche to move quickly without raising flags. Nah, a bike like that is stolen to order. It's going into a crate, and it's going overseas to a private collector who doesn't care about a 6 number. Can you find it before they ship it?" Arthur asked, his voice trembling.
Jim turned to Declan. Dec, wake the chapter up. Call everyone.
I want eyes on every chop shop, every shipping yard, and every sketchy porn broker from here to Vallejo.
Put the word out.
Whoever took Iron Arthur's bike has exactly 3 hours to return it, or the Hells Angels are going to burn their operation to the ground. By 3:30 a.m., the Oakland charter had mobilized a small army. While the police department slept, dozens of leather-clad riders were shaking down the city's underbelly. They didn't need probable cause. They operated on a currency of fear and respect. Declan and Wyatt took the industrial district down by the docks. They were looking for a specific type of criminal, someone arrogant enough to steal a vintage Harley, but connected enough to have international shipping contacts. At 4:15 a.m., they cornered a low-level methamphetamine dealer and chop shop middleman named Skelly. Skelly was sitting in the driver's seat of a rusted-out Honda Civic behind a closed diner when Declan's fist shattered the driver's side window. Before Skelly could scream, Wyatt had him dragged out by his collar, pinning him against the brick wall of the alley. Hey, I didn't do nothing,"
Skelly shrieked, spitting glass.
Wyatt stepped forward, towering over the terrified man. A cherry-red 48 panhead got pulled out of a garage on the east side 3 hours ago. "Who's moving vintage iron tonight?" "Skelly, I don't know, man."
I sviar just pushpils.
Declan grabbed Skelly by the throat, lifting him an inch off the ground. "The brother's wife is in the saddlebag of that bike. If it gets loaded onto a freighter, I'm going to make sure you never walk again. You have 10 seconds.
Think fast."
Skelly's eyes darted wildly between the two massive men. The reputation of the men in front of him wasn't an exaggeration.
It was a promise. Okay.
Skelly choked out as Declan slightly loosened his grip.
"It's Dominic. Dominic Reed.
He's been running a specialized ring for the past month, taking classic bikes, crating them up in fake automotive parts crates. He's got an operation out of the old abandoned textile warehouse on Fortham Maritime. He's loading a container tonight to beat the morning harbor patrol." Wyatt dropped Skelly into the mud and immediately pulled out his phone, hitting Jim's number. "We got a name and the location," Wyatt said into the receiver. "Dominic Reed, old textile warehouse on 4th. He's crating it up right now." On the other end of the line, sitting in Arthur's kitchen, Jim Bronson stood up, a dangerous glint in his eye. "Round up the boys," Jim commanded. "We're going to pay Mr. Deary Reed a visit." Jim hung up the phone and looked at Arthur, who was clutching his empty coffee mug. "Arthur," Jim said quietly,
"Get your coat.
"we're going to get Martha back." The ride to the docks was a blur of neon streaks and freezing spray. Arthur clung to the heavy leather of Jim Bronson's jacket, riding pillion on a massive road glide. Behind them, a convoy of 15 screaming Bwin engines tore through the desolate, rain-slick streets of Oakland. It was a mechanical cavalry, a terrifying wave of chrome and thunder, completely ignoring red lights and stop signs. For the first time since he had discovered the broken padlock, the suffocating ice in Arthur's chest began to thaw, replaced by a surging white-hot rush of adrenaline. He wasn't just a helpless old widower anymore. He was riding with the devil's own vanguard. They reached the waterfront district just before 5 o'clock in the morning. The air was thick with the scent of brine rotting kelp and diesel exhaust. Jim signaled with a raised gloved hand, and the thunderous roar of the motorcycles instantly dropped to a low, menacing idle. They coasted the last 2 blocks with their headlights cut, becoming a pack of leather-clad phantoms, slipping through the heavy marine layer. The old textile warehouse on 4th and Maritime loomed out of the fog like a decaying behemoth. Its windows were shattered or boarded over, and the surrounding chain-link fence was overgrown with dead weeds. However, a sliver of harsh halogen light bled from beneath a massive corrugated steel loading bay door at the rear. A pristine white box truck, the kind used for moving furniture, was backed halfway down the ramp. Jim killed his engine. The others followed suit. The sudden silence was absolute, broken only by the distant wail of a foghorn. Jim gestured toward Declan and Wyatt. "Dec, take 3 guys and secure the front exits. Wyatt, you're with me." "We're going through the loading bay," Jim whispered, his voice a low, authoritative rumble.
He turned to Arthur.
"Stay right behind me."
You point out your bike.
We handled the rest. Wyatt walked over to the reinforced padlock securing the heavy chain on the loading bay door. He didn't bother with bolt cutters. He drew a heavy short-barreled shotgun from a custom scabbard strapped to his bike, pressed the muzzle directly against the steel lock, and pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening in the enclosed alleyway. The lock disintegrated into a spray of metal shrapnel. Before the echo could even fade, Jim and two other massive bikers grabbed the heavy chain at the bottom of the corrugated door and heaved upward. The door screamed on rusted tracks, flying open to reveal the blindingly bright interior of the chop shop.
Nobody moves.
Jim roared, stepping into the warehouse with the presence of a conquering warlord. Inside, the scene was one of frantic, illicit industry. Piles of motorcycle frames, engines on hoists, and power tools were scattered across the concrete floor. 4 men were in the center of the room. 2 were operating a forklift, while the other 2, including a slick-haired man in an expensive leather jacket who could only be Dominic Reed, were physically pushing Arthur's beloved 1948 pan head onto a wooden shipping pallet. They had already begun wrapping the front forks in heavy industrial plastic. Dominic Reed's head snapped up, his face instantly draining of color as he took in the wall of heavily tattooed giants standing in his doorway. One of the men working the forklift reached instinctively for the waistband of his jeans. Wyatt racked the slide of his shotgun with a sharp metallic clack that froze the man's hand in place. "Touch it, and I'll paint that forklift with you," Wyatt growled, stepping into the light. Dominic slowly raised his hands, adopting a placating smile that didn't reach his terrified eyes. "Gentlemen, look, whatever turf this is, I didn't know. We can work this out.
I have cash. Lots of it." Jim didn't say a word.
He walked slowly across the room, his heavy boots echoing off the concrete until he was standing inches from Dominic. Jim was a foot taller and 80 pounds heavier. He reached out, grabbed Dominic by the lapels of his expensive jacket and effortlessly slammed him backward against the side of the box truck.
The impact
left a dent in the aluminum siding. "You don't have enough cash in the world to buy your next breath," Jim whispered dangerously. While Jim handled the ringleader, Arthur rushed past them. His knees screamed in protest, but he didn't care. He practically threw himself at the pan head. He ran a trembling hand over the cherry-red gas tank, wiping away the smudges left by the thieves. It was relatively unharmed, but the bike wasn't what he came for. With frantic shaking fingers, Arthur reached for the heavy leather saddlebag on the left side. He undid the brass buckles, his breath hitching in his throat. He threw the leather flap back and plunged his hand inside. He felt the rough interior of the leather. He felt a stray spark plug he kept at the bottom. But there was no canvas. There was no waterproof Ziploc bag. Arthur's heart completely stopped. He fell to his knees beside the bike, frantically digging both hands into the bag, then tearing open the right saddlebag, throwing tools and rags onto the floor.
Empty.
"Arthur," Jim called out, turning away from Dominic.
"You got it."
Arthur looked up, his face an ashen mask of pure, unadulterated devastation. Tears freely streamed down his weathered cheeks.
"It's gone, Jim."
Arthur choked out, his voice a broken, hollow sound that made even the hardest bikers in the room flinch.
"The picture, Martha. She's gone."
A terrifying, suffocating silence fell over the warehouse. The air grew perceptibly colder. Big Jim Bronson slowly turned his head back to Dominic Reed. The look in the club president's eyes was no longer just intimidating. It was murderous. "Where is it?" Jim asked, his voice barely a whisper. Yet it cut through the room like a razor blade. "Where is what?" Dominic panicked, struggling against Jim's massive grip.
"It's a bike. We just took the bike."
"I don't know what you're talking about." Jim slammed him against the truck again, harder this time.
"The saddlebags."
There was a wrapped photograph in the left saddlebag. "Where did you put it?" Dominic's eyes darted frantically toward a young, skinny kid standing near the forklift, trembling like a leaf. "Lenny, what did you do with the garbage in the bags?"
"Tell them."
Lenny looked like he was about to pass out. He backed away, putting his hands up defensively as Wyatt and Declan turned their imposing glares on him.
"I didn't know."
Then he stammered, tears springing to his eyes.
"We have a rule.
You ditch the personal effects before you bring the iron to the warehouse. If the cops pull us over, personal items prove the theft instantly. I stripped the bags 2 blocks away from the old man's house. Arthur felt the world spinning.
Where? He roared.
Finding a sudden furious strength, he scrambled to his feet and lunged at Lenny, grabbing the boy's shirt.
Where did you throw her? A dumpster. Lenny sobbed.
Behind the liquor store on 8th and Elm.
The blue one.
I just chucked everything in there. I swear to God I didn't look at it.
I'm sorry.
Wyatt checked his heavy steel wristwatch. Jim, it's 5:30 a.m. Trash pickup for the commercial district on the east side starts at 6. Tie these scumbags to the forklift, Jim ordered instantly.
Leave them for the cops.
We ride now. The Hells Angels left the warehouse as quickly as they had breached it, leaving the panhead behind for the moment.
The bike could wait.
The photograph could not. They mounted their machines, the engines roaring to life with a desperate urgency. The ride back across town was a terrifying race against the clock. The fog was lifting, replaced by the bleak gray light of the early morning. They blew through intersections, the deafening roar of their pipes clearing the sleepy morning traffic out of their way. Arthur gripped Jint's jacket, praying to a god he hadn't spoken to in years. Please, just this one thing.
Let me keep her.
They arrived at the corner of 8th and Elm at 5:52 a.m. The heavy groaning sound of hydraulics echoed down the street. 2 blocks away, a massive green sanitation truck was slowly making its way down the alleyway, emptying dumpsters with mechanical ruthlessness. Block the alley.
Jim shouted.
Declan, Wyatt, and 3 others gunned their bikes, sliding them sideways across the entrance of the alley, creating an impenetrable wall of steel and muscle directly in the path of the approaching garbage truck. The driver slammed on his air brakes, blaring his horn in outrage, but the bikers didn't even flinch. Declan casually crossed his arm, staring the furious driver down. Meanwhile, Jim stopped right in front of the peeling blue commercial dumpster behind the liquor store. Arthur practically fell off the back of the bike, scrambling toward the rusted metal bin. Get in there, boys, Jim commanded in a scene that defied every stereotype of the outlaw biker. 6 heavily patched members of the Hells Angels, men who struck fear into the hearts of rival gangs and law enforcement alike, immediately climbed over the rusted lip of the filthy dumpster. They stood knee-deep in rotting vegetables, discarded cardboard and slime, digging through the refuse bare hands in the freezing drizzle.
Look for oiled canvas.
Wyatt barked, throwing black garbage bags over his shoulder. Waterproof Ziplo. Tear everything open. Arthur stood by the edge, his hands gripping the metal rims so hard his knuckles were entirely white. The minutes dragged on like hours. The garbage truck down the alley continued to blare its horn. Arthur's hope began to bleed out of him. It was a needle in a haystack.
It was gone.
Hold up, a voice grunted from the back corner of the bin. It was Leo, the young prospect. He was holding up a rectangular bundle coated in coffee grounds and wet ash. It was a piece of heavy oiled canvas wrapped tightly and sealed inside a clear plastic bag. Is this it, Iron Arthur? Leo asked, carefully wiping the grime off the plastic with his leather sleeve.
Arthur's breath caught.
He reached out with trembling hands, taking the package from the young biker. He pulled the Ziplo open and unrolled the canvas. There she was, Martha, leaning against the bar at the Grand Canyon, her blonde hair catching the summer wind, smiling brightly right at him. The photo was completely untouched, safe. Arthur collapsed against the side of the dumpster, clutching the photograph to his chest, burying his face in his dirty hands as heavy, uncontrollable sobs racked his body. Big Jim Bronson climbed out of the trash, wiping his hands on a relatively clean rag. He placed a massive, comforting hand on Arthur's trembling shoulder. We got her, brother, Jim said softly, a gentle smile cracking his hardened features.
We brought her home.
Later that morning, Officer Miller and Officer Jenkins received an anonymous tip from a pay phone. They arrived at the warehouse on 4th and Maritime to find the biggest stolen motorcycle ring in the Bay Area, tied securely to a forklift, neatly gift-wrapped with heavy-duty zip ties. And sitting quietly in Arthur Hickens' driveway, escorted by a dozen roaring Harley-Davidsons, was a pristine 1948 Panhead. Arthur sat in his garage, the rain finally stopping, holding his coffee and looking at the Polaroid now safely framed on his workbench. The law had given up, but the Brotherhood had remembered. Arthur's incredible journey proves that sometimes the most unexpected people have the biggest hearts. It wasn't the law that saved his most precious memory, but a brotherhood that refused to leave a man behind. If Arthur and Martha's story touched your heart, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable true stories just like yes.